This is a footnote about terms. Because I'm a professor, I'm a pedant by nature and profession. So I can't resist clarifying in advance that I'm simplifying terminology ever so slightly for the sake of making a nice colloquial, watchable set of videos. The first thing is the name of the guns themselves. What I'm going to call the Chinese SKS and the Chinese AK-47, of course, are not called that in China. In Chinese nomenclature, they're classified as the Type 56 semi-automatic rifle, 五六式半自动步枪, and the Type 56 submachine gun, 五六式冲锋枪. That's right, a submachine gun, not an assault rifle. As we're going to see, in the period covered by this story, in Chinese, a submachine gun is any automatic shoulder weapon. Doesn't matter what kind of cartridge it fires. It could be an M16. In fact, well into the 1980s and beyond, in colloquial and official Chinese, if you were talking about the US M16, you would refer to it as the Americans' M16 submachine gun. It was only quite a bit later that the concept of assault rifle, or 突击步枪, really entered the Chinese lexicon. Nowadays, Chinese gun people will talk about the Chinese AK as an assault rifle, but in the sources of the time, it was simply a submachine gun. Another thing to note is the name the People's Liberation Army. Of course, Chinese Communist forces weren't always called that. For example, in much of the Chinese Civil War, they were called the Chinese Workers and Peasants Red Army, 中国工农红军. And they went by some other names during the Civil War too. Later on, after 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party unified the Chinese mainland, communist military changed its name to the People's Liberation Army. But there are exceptions to that too. For example, when Chinese Communist forces went to Korea, officially, they were called the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. That was a kind of diplomatic fig leaf so that Beijing could not acknowledge that they were sending regular Chinese Communist government forces. And they could maintain this official pretense that really it was just a bunch of independent Chinese volunteers who had formed a kind of international brigade to go and assist the North Koreans. But just for simplicity's sake, at whatever point in history we're talking about, during the Civil War, after the Civil War, I'm just going to refer to the Chinese Communist military forces as the People's Liberation Army, or simply the Chinese Army. Now, even that's a little bit tricky, because, strictly speaking, ever since there's been a modern nation state called China, beginning in 1912, there's always been more than one army that could lay claim to the title, the Chinese Army. In the warlord period, there were, countless different armies contending with each other. During the Civil War, and even since 1949, there have been the Chinese Communist Forces, and there's been the Republic of China Army, which still exists in Taiwan. And both Beijing and Taipei agree that there is one China, and so, strictly speaking, even today, China doesn't just have one army, singular. But for our series here, when I say the Chinese Army, I mean the Chinese Communist Army, the People's Liberation Army. Okay, that's enough terminological pedantry. Let's get started with the fun stuff.